Thanks everyone for joining today's session on JMeter for developers and DevOps. My name is Ophir Prusak. I'm the VP of Product Strategy at BlazeMeter. Today's session will be recorded and we will be sending out the recording to all the attendees afterwards. If you have any questions, you can go ahead and enter so in the GoToWebinar control panel in the questions box. We have a lot to cover, so let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to start with just a really quick overview of what is performance testing. We're going to then go to understanding how JMeter works. I'll go over the interface and vocabulary of JMeter terminology. We'll then go show you a simple script in JMeter. I'll then show you how to handle logins and authentication. Going to show you integrations with Jenkins and New Relic for CI and APM. And at the end, we'll have about 10 minutes for Q&A. Again, if you have any questions, you can go ahead and enter so in the GoToWebinar control panel under questions. So first of all, why do we need performance testing in the first place? We want to make sure that all users have a good user experience, and that's fast or error-free and under any load. Means regardless of if you have 10 users or 10,000 users, you want to make sure that users have a good user experience. Because at the end of the day, if they don't, you're going to leave your website, and that usually equates to your website losing money or sometimes even people losing their jobs. So how do we do this? It's two parts. First of all, we need to create the user load in the first place by using a tool like JMeter. And then also we want to measure the user experience. And this is measured using mostly two different KPIs I like to use. One is that it's fast. Fast meaning what's the response time? What's the latency? How long does it take for a page to load? And secondly, that it's error-free. How many errors am I getting? Am I getting just 0.1% of errors, which is okay? Or are 5% of the people who are talking only able to see me? Okay, it looks to me like there's some issues with the audio. I do see one person who said that they can't hear me. If anybody can hear me, can you please enter in the GoToWebinar control panel that you can hear me okay? I'd appreciate. Okay, so it seems like just one person can't hear me. I was kind of afraid that I was talking to myself there for a minute. Thanks a lot. So continuing on. So having said that, I'm going to show you how to use JMeter in order to do performance testing. So before we talk about JMeter, I want to talk a little about how a browser works versus how JMeter works. Because a lot of times I hear questions that there's a big misunderstanding in how JMeter works. So first, let's start about how does a browser work? And again, this is a talk for developers for DevOps. So most of this should be just known to you already. So the way a browser works is first of all, a user performs an action. That could be enter a URL in the actual address bar. It could be clicking a button. It could be some AJAX, which is happening behind the scenes, but there's some user interaction with the browser. And as a result of that, the browser will send a request, usually an HTTP request to the backend. The server response says, here's your HTML images or whatever, here's maybe some JSON data. Then the browser parses the response, if it's an HTML, get the images, resources, etc., and will execute any JavaScript on the page and then repeat. So again, you have a browser or maybe even a mobile app, user performs action, browser sends a request, server parses it, etc., etc. On the other hand, JMeter, unlike a browser, works purely at the network communication layer. So it just does the HTTP requests going back and forth. There is no browser. It's just kind of the language that the back end and the front end are talking. So user performs an action doesn't exist. All JMeter is doing is it's sending an HTTP request. So you need to know in advance what that actual HTTP request is. And I'll show you in a minute how you can actually, there's some shortcuts. The server respond, how is your HTML, etc. And what we're going to do is actually record or measure how long it takes for the server to respond. It could be for the HTML, images, etc. Now, just looking at these two parts here, this is one of the things that we internally say is that JMeter is all about back-end testing, because ultimately what you're testing is server response times at the end of the day. That could be a server response time for an HTML. It could be server response time for an HTML and all the images included, but still it's server response time or backend. Or you could be testing the backend of an API or a mobile app. It's still server response times. Now, the other part is that JMeter, JMeter parses the response optionally and executes a JavaScript. So first of all, JMeter does not execute JavaScript. If there's any JavaScript on the page which needs to be executed, I'm assuming that the execution of JavaScript is ultimately going to cause an HTTP request sent to the backend server. So you need to kind of fill in the blanks and make sure that your JMeter script actually makes the same request that the page would have made in the first place. The one place that JMeter is able to do some parsing is in simple HTML applications where I'm including images and CSS files, etc. JMeter does have the ability to actually go and request those additional resources from the page and then repeat. So again, browsers work actually user actions, JMeter works by HTTP requests. Now that we understand how JMeter works, let's actually take a look at the JMeter interface, because to be honest, I think it's very confusing for someone who sees it for the first time. So I'm going to show it to you really quick. Here we go. Here's the actual user interface. Here's what it looks like, and I'll go over the stuff. I will say one thing regarding the user interface, in that I like to compare JMeter to the cockpit of a 747. There's probably hundreds of dials and gauges and levers, but at the end of the day, in order to fly the plane, you probably only need 4 or 5 of them. And the same is the same applies to JMeter. There's a lot of stuff when you try to set things up and run things. At the end of the day, you're probably only going to be using 4 or 5 of them. So here's actually an existing script. What I'm going to do is actually bring up a brand new instance here, and to show you just how to start doing it. Then we'll come back to this one, which shows you a kind of a pre-made script. Same way they have cooking classes. So here's a brand new JMeter. I just installed it. JMeter, by the way, is totally cross-platform. It is a Java application in that what it's written in, but of course you can test anything with it. But it runs on Mac, Linux, PC, etc. So here's once you start JMeter up, and I'm going to let you take care of that yourself. You can go to the Apache website to download it. You're going to see a screen like this. Now, the main interface in JMeter is your right click. So I can right click on test plan or right click on workbench, etc. Everything is going to be right click and then add. Now, just in case of the interface, I'll go really, really quickly. This stuff on the left, this is kind of your tree where you create all the commands you're going to do. And on the right, this is the detail view. And on the top, you have some buttons in order for the navigation. So really, really quickly, I'm going to show you how in 30 seconds, I'm going to create a simple script just to test a few web pages. The first thing I'm going to, before we do so, I do need to go over the vocabulary because it's going to be a little confusing. When I click on add, you're going to see you can add a threads, test fragments, config element, timer, pre-processors, post-processors, assertions, and listeners. That's a lot of stuff to take in if you're not a JMeter user. So let me make it really, really simple for you. Threads are simply users. For whatever reason, a user is called a thread in JMeter, and a thread group is simply a group of users. That's it. Test fragment, that's kind of a simple include, which is what it sounds like. I want to do an include. A config element, this is basically your configuration file, which I won't go into specifics, but depending on where you're trying to do, things which are going to be test-wide, or I should say applicable to the entire script, you're going to be config elements. And then you have some other ones. So before I go into the other ones, I do want to show you the first thing I'm going to do is add a thread group. Again, you did a right click on test plan, add threads thread group. I'll give this some name, simple test. And now to the thread group, this is a group of users. I can actually add, there's a few other things which just appeared. And the most important one, and where you're going to do 90% of your work on, is a sampler. A sampler in JMeter is simply a fancy word for something which makes a request. And you'll notice you have all sorts of different samplers. Again, ignore most of it. The most important one for you is probably going to be an HTTP request. So I'm going to click on HTTP request. And here I'm going to be using for the purpose of this demonstration the Blaze demo website, which is a simple website. I'm going to do server name www.blazedemo.com, and the path is just going to be /. And that's kind of basically it. There's some other stuff I could go into, but I'll keep it really, really simple. I'll do a right click and I'll do duplicate. And here's another request. And this time I want it to be / let's say WordPress. Okay. So here's a really, really simple test, just 2 pages. Now, the only other thing you need to know in JMeter in order to understand what's going on is that you also want what's called a listener. Again, right click, add listener. A listener is a fancy name for getting data out of JMeter. It can be a report, it can be a graph, it can be a table. It's basically getting information back. So I'm going to choose here a listener called the view results tree, which is great for using for debugging. That's basically the only place you should do it. So going back to simple test, I'm going to do really quick. How many users? So I want, let's say 5 users. I want to ramp up to 5 users in 1 second, and I want to loop over these 2 requests twice. Now you might notice that these 2 requests have the same name. So I'm going to go ahead and change the name. This is going to be homepage, and this is going to be WordPress. I know I'm going kind of fast, but there's a lot to cover. So now I'm going to hit the start button. And let's actually save it really quick. And let's just call this simple. Now you'll notice when I go to save it, it's looking to save a file with a JMX extension. JMeter saves XML files with JMX extensions, which is basically the format of the JMeter script. Now, by the way, if you're used to using other tools, let's say like Selenium, for instance, they use a different type of architecture where you're not actually storing a script, you're sending commands in your favorite programming language like Python or Ruby or Java. So you're sending commands in your programming language to the Selenium server or to the WebDriver. JMeter, on the other hand, you save a script and then JMeter itself executes that script in order to create the load. I'll call this simple, hit save, and I'll hit the play button. Well, actually, the play button was already started. The results tree. And here you can see all the requests. Voila. They all have green arrows, which means everything went fine. Everything worked perfectly. Going back here really quick here, I saw loop count twice. So I had 5 users looped over twice. Ramp up period. This will make more sense to you when you start using large numbers. But as it is, you can see it doesn't tell me too much information other than it seems to have worked okay. So if I add one other listener, again, right click, add listener, and this time it's going to be summary report. Here I have a nice Excel type graph. Going to run it again. And here you can see how many requests I had to each one of the pages. And here's where I start to get some actual data. What was the average response time? What was the minimum response time, the maximum response time? All this information is in milliseconds, by the way. Throughput, kilobytes per second, etc. So you can already see that I can run a simple test here. Now instead of 5 users, I want it to be, let's say, 20 users. And I'm going to hit Command E. Command E, by the way, on the Mac, or I think it's Control E on a PC, will reset the data. By the way, when you go to run, you can see here clear and clear all. So depending on if you're using a Mac or PC, it'll tell you how to do it. So again, I hit run. And this time I'm doing it with 20 users. I can see here, this tells me how many users are currently running. Here's the data, how many samples. And again, I get some more information about how long it's taking. I can see already it's taking a little longer now for the responses. I'm guessing that's because I'm creating some load and the backend is kind of slow. But that's basically, you'll see these will actually stop in a few seconds. But in a nutshell, I can see it's working. I'm getting some data. But at this point, there's two things which are really missing. A, I want to create a much more complex script, not just hitting two static web pages over and over again. And B, I want to also see this data in a way that I can actually get some insightful takeaways, like how many users can my website actually handle, and what's a breaking point, etc. So I'm going to go ahead and hit stop. Okay. And now I'm going to bring up another script, or actually before I do so, I want to bring up here just a few of the terminology that you'll see, and we're not going to go over everything today, but some of the terminology of what it's called in JMeter, and then what it's called in human speak. Because again, when we go back to here, and actually I'll make this a little smaller, you'll notice that when I do a right click on the thread group and add, you'll see there's a lot of stuff. So some of the terms you might see either used in online video tutorials or even within the Apache official documentation is, first of all, test plan. A test plan, here you can see a test plan is simply what they call a JMeter script. A thread group, that's simply a group of users where a thread equals one user. A sampler is used to make a request, like make an HTTP request. Config elements, that defines things as part of the script. A timer adds a delay between requests. The simple script that I made, which had just two requests, I didn't add any delay between them. But in real world scenarios, if you can imagine somebody coming to your coming to your home page, adding something to the cart, and then doing a checkout, there's going to be some delay between the requests, and timers add those delays. Listeners are used for reporting, logging, and debugging. I can do a listener which gives me debug information or creates a summary Excel report or even some graphing. Assertions are made for error checking. We're not going to have time to go into assertions, but I will say already that when you write a script, it's not enough just to make the request. You might want to say, okay, this request has to return not only an error code of 200, but it has to have a specific string in it like login OK. So assertions will allow you to do error checking. Or you could also have assertions doing not just based on the response itself, but maybe I want to make sure that the response is less than 2 seconds. And if it's more than 2 seconds, I'm going to consider that an error. Then we have pre and post processors. A pre-processor allows you to modify the request before you make it, and a post processor allows you to parse the response. We're going to see post processors in a minute when we get to doing user login authentication. Logic controllers, that as you can guess, is like ifs, whiles, etc. And then the workbench, which is temporary working space. This is the workbench at the bottom. Some of the activity you're going to do here, but basically allows you to add non-test elements and some other things that you can play around with. So that's it in terms of vocabulary. I know it's a little confusing, but let's actually go ahead and start working with JMeter, and I think things will be a little clearer in terms of how to actually go and write some scripts. So going back to the static simple script, let's look at one which is slightly more complex to look at more realistically what we would have in a test, which is a test for this application. I'll show you it really quickly. Here's a simple demo application. Here we go. So here's a simple demo application which I use for the purpose of demo. It's a home page, and here I have a form, and I'm actually filling out these two form fields. I'm clicking on Find Flights. I'm choosing one of these flights. I'm filling out some more form information. And this is 123 My Street, etc., etc. I'm filling out a visa number. This is my real visa number. Please don't use it. Just kidding. And of course, my big boss. Purchase flight. Now, these steps that I just took at the end of the day created HTTP requests. Now, there's a lot of different ways I can look at those HTTP requests depending on my favorite developer tool. I can do something like this, or right-click, inspect element, and actually use, which is one of my favorite developer tools under network. And I can see the actual requests. So I could do here a refresh and continue. And I could then look at the developer tools and see here the actual requests which are going on. Obviously, I don't care so much about the JSs, but I do care about the actual page request itself. You can use something like Charles Proxy. You can also use JMeter itself as a proxy to actually record your browser activity and turn it into a JMeter script. My personal favorite is using BlazeMeter's Chrome plugin. I'm not going to have time to go into it now, but I will show you we have a Chrome plugin you can simply download, which will allow you to simply use your browser, and then when you're done browsing, you can export your activity into a JMeter script, and it's a standard JMeter script. So that's the easiest way, if you ask me, just use our Chrome plugin, but you can use any way you want. So again, we had some requests, and I'm going to show you those same requests this time in actually JMeter. But you'll notice there's a few additional elements here. So first of all, almost all websites use cookies. So if I do a right click on the test, I can do add a config element in what's called a cookie manager. This simply means that your entire script will automatically handle cookies the way it should handle. There's nothing else to configure. You just do add the cookie manager and you're good. One thing you do want to be careful about in terms of cookies, or I shouldn't say careful, but aware of, is the clear cookies on each iteration. So if you imagine you have somebody who's going through some checkout, etc., and you're looping over the same user over and over again, do you want to be clearing the cookies each iteration, yes or no? It depends on what you're looking to do. I usually say yes, but in some instances you might want to say no. The cache manager, again, it's very simple to use. You do a right click on the actual test, add, config element, the HTTP cache manager, and now your test will be able to support caching like a real browser would. Again, you can do clear cache each iteration, each loop, or not. And then last but not least, the HTTP request defaults. So you can imagine within your test, you might have certain elements such as the server name, which is going to be the same for every single request, or something like a timeout. And there's some other advanced stuff I'm not going to go into. But this allows you to have request defaults. The way the request defaults work is that for every request you have, if you didn't fill out one of the fields here, then it will simply use the request defaults. Another thing which you might want to be using, by the way, is the HTTP header manager. So this will give you some defaults of the HTTP headers, so every single request will have the same headers. Now, this script that I'm showing you here, I was using a tool, actually using the BlazeMeter Chrome plugin to record the script, in which case it automatically also recorded all of the information in the header manager. And you can see what's going on here. So I don't actually need it here. And I'll go ahead and remove that. Another thing you'll notice that there's some level of hierarchy here in terms of all of these elements are at the same level as the thread group. So all of these requests are basically children of this thread group, and the cookie manager and cache manager will all apply to here. In this case, I have a constant timer. That's a delay between the requests. You'll see that in terms of hierarchy, it's a sibling to these 4 requests, which means the constant timer is being applied to all 4 of these equally. If I just wanted to add a timer, just let's say to the search request, not to the other ones, I could move it to be a child here of search. Here you can see it went deeper in terms of the hierarchy. Now this 500 millisecond delay is just after the search page. But again, I want it to be here, so it applies to all of them. So here's the same request as we saw beforehand, that simple application where there's a search page, there's a reservation page, a purchase page, and a confirmation page. But this time you can see instead of just simple requests, the search page is due to simple request, there's a reservation page. I'm actually using HTTP post method, and I'm also passing in some data from port to port with the values where, now I didn't have to manually put this information in. It was already recorded for me by using the Chrome plugin. So I have to say that Chrome plugin just makes things so much easier when you're recording. You still sometimes need to go in and make small modifications, But at least for getting a skeleton, it's kind of a no-brainer. So here we have a request, and I'll also go to view results tree. Let me enable it. And let's actually see how this works. I'm using 4 users with 3 loop count and a timer of 500 milliseconds between requests. Go ahead and play this. And you can see the searches. By the way, you actually might have noticed that there is a triangle next to each one of these pages. And if I click on it, you can see there's a lot of additional requests being made. So when I did the search, you can see it went to this page, but also there's some JS and CSS files which are also being requested. What happened here is under HTTP, here we go, search. There is an option under the HTTP request called Retrieve All Embedded Resources. So as I told you beforehand, if you're making a request to a web page, JMeter does have the ability to then go and in parallel make a request to any image or CSS file which is included, but it needs to be included purely at the HTML level. JMeter, again, will not execute any JavaScript, so if you have an additional file which is included as part of a JavaScript executed, it won't be included if you just do retrieve all HTML files. So I'm going to actually uncheck these really quickly, just to show you the difference. And in terms of best practices, usually I don't include the embedded resources because I really want to measure just the page load time itself, not how long it took to load everything together with the page. And here, if I go and do it again, let me actually do Command E and go, you can see this time, A, it's a lot faster because it's not making requests for any of the additional files. And B, you can see it doesn't have the plus, so it's just asking those. So that in a nutshell is a really simple script. And by the way, if one of the requests were to fail, let's say I go to reserve, and let's say I had a typo here. Let's say reserve X, and I hit play. What you'd see here in the view results tree is any request which fails, and by fails, I mean if it doesn't return a valid HTTP request, so if it's a 404 or a 500, it's going to return a red button. I can just scroll automatically. By the way, not only 200s are considered okay. If it's a 200 or like a 301 or 304, those are also considered okay. So let's go back to reserve and let's actually fix it. And we're good to go. So that in a nutshell is usually what you want to do in terms of debugging. But the next question is, okay, now I see how easy it is to write a simple script with just kind of some simple get and post stuff. But now I want to actually handle a user login. And that's where things get a little more complicated. And the reason they get a little more complicated is that everything I've showed you in terms of the stuff so far is really based on the fact that this script is going to send the exact same information byte for byte for each user. But in some cases, especially with user logins, there's something called a dynamic authentication token, which means if I were to play back, if I were to literally record the user's HTTP requests and then play them back, let's say an hour later, the server would answer with some error because the authentication token needs to be dynamically created at the beginning of the session. And that's what I'm going to show you the whole point of user logins. I do want to really quickly address a question or a bit of confusion regarding why do I even need the cookie manager or the cache manager in terms of clear cache iteration. So each iteration here means when I'm done looping through all of these, or I should say, in this script I have 4 requests. Request number 1, 2, 3, and 4. So both the cookie and the cache manager will live between the requests. So from the search, in this request, let's say there was a file, an included file, which was let's say your home page image or some icon or some image. If it was requested again here, then actually what will happen is I'll get a 3 or 4, or basically it'll be cached. On the other hand, once I finish this script and then start over, at that point, I'm basically clearing the cache. And the same thing goes for cookies. It could be between page 1 to page 2 to page 3, I need to have the cookies basically stay live. But when I'm done with the whole script and I want to basically start over again, at that point, it's the cookies and the cache are cleared. So each iteration means after I go through all the steps at least once. So now that we've cleared that up, going back to how do I deal with a user login? Because to be honest, it's not that trivial, especially when we handle things like dynamic authentication token. So again, going back to using an example from the real world, let's take a look at a script, here we go, of a username of logging into this application. So here I have a really simple application where I have my username and my password. I'm going to hit login, and I'll see that I actually did log in. But what was happening behind the scenes is a lot more complex. Now, I've saved us some time by actually loading in advance. Let me minimize this. By actually loading in advance, here we go, the actual script which deals with all that information. And I'm not going to go over the specifics. The way of how I got this, I will just say that this script, again, was created by using the Chrome plugin, which will record all the activity. And I cleaned out a few of the unnecessary lines, but this is more or less what it looks like. And I'll see that the first request I have is simply going to this /ghost/sign-in page, and it's a get page. And here I'll notice there's one additional, excuse me, there's one additional element which you didn't have beforehand, and it's a processor. It's a post request processor. If I do a right click here and I do add post processor, there's one which is called a regular expression extractor, and that's what I have here. And what this does is it allows me to basically pull data from the request, save it in a variable using a regular expression. So looking at the request itself really quickly, you'll notice that in the request itself, just a second, let me go back to here. In the request itself, if I hit back, anyway, forward. Oh, wait a second, I have to log out. Let me actually sign out. Here we go. So I'm in the sign-in page. If I do a right click and I do view page source, you'll notice you have here at the top something called CSRF param. And that's actually a cross-site forgery request parameter, a cross-site request forgery parameter. Basically, it's for security purposes to make sure that somebody isn't trying to forge who you are. And this content piece, this is a random string, which is just for your session, and that's the dynamic authentication token. Now, if we would have had time to look a little closer over, and actually in terms of the request and the response, you would have seen that this CSRF parameter exists, here we go, exists in the actual HTTP manager, here we go, in the following request, the X CSRF token, and previously what it had here was the actual token string itself. So what I've gone ahead and done is I've added the regular expression extractor again by right-click, add post-processor, regular expression extractor. I'm giving it a name. This is the variable name, CSRF token. I'm giving it a regular expression. Here's a regular expression which is basically defining what the actual, or I should say the regular expression which defines how to find the information I'm looking for. Here it's meta, name, etc., etc. And content, for those of you who aren't regular expression people, this defines the actual regular expression here, everything between the two parentheses, and this defines any string. And I want to take basically the first instance of that. So in a nutshell, I'm doing a regular expression, I'm looking for the authentication token, and I'm storing it into a variable called CRF token. And by the way, instead of actually trying to get the regular expression from the body of the response, I could have also gotten it from the header as well if I have some information from the header itself. So I took it, put in CRF token, and then in my next request, where you can see I'm trying to log in, and this is, again, don't use my password, please. Where I'm trying to log in, the HTTP post, you'll notice that in the HTTP header manager, I have here XCRF token $, open curly brackets, CRF token, close curly brackets. So if it wasn't obvious until now, the way you create, or the way you actually, the syntax for variables in JMeter is $, open curly brackets, the name of the variable, and then close curly brackets. So in a nutshell, what I'm doing here is simply using, again, that value in my additional requests. And here you can see I'm using it again some other places where, in order to actually make the post itself, I need to, here we go, CRF token. Again, I'm using it here because when I actually try to make a post of some information, it's going to ask me for that header. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, this is all good, if you know in advance what to do. So I will already say that any website that you log in is going to have some dynamic authentication token mechanism. It does vary from site to site or from technology to technology. In terms of, like, if it's a WordPress or a Drupal or some other standard CMS, it's usually standard per that CMS. So once you figured it out for that CMS, you can figure it out for all instances of that type of CMS. The best way to try to find it, or if you do have to debug it yourself, is if you go and simply record the user activity and save it as a script and then play it back, you're going to see errors at some point because you're trying to play it back, and you can basically look for something which looks like or some random string, because that's going to be your culprit. And anywhere there's a random string, if you look back to all the requests, look for the first time that random string appeared. That's how you get the token. So again, what I did in this instance was I used the Chrome plugin in order to, first of all, create the script in the first place. I then loaded it into JMeter and I played it, and then I started to see some errors. So, I can actually show you that really quick here in just a few seconds. Just 1 second. Sorry about that. Okay, so if I go back here, I run the Chrome plugin, and I start the recording. And actually, let me do this. If you do use a Chrome plugin, by the way, you do need to uncheck the record only top level requests if you're trying to record anything which has AJAX requests. Record only top level requests only will record whatever appears in your address bar. But in this case, there's a lot of backend AJAX requests. So you need to uncheck it. I am warning you, you're going to get a lot of requests, which you might necessarily want, but you can always clean them out. So I uncheck this, start recording. Wait, let me hit stop just a second. Okay. And reset. And now I'll uncheck this, and I'll do start recording, and it's recording. And now if I go here and log into the page, you can see there's already 10 requests, 11, hit login. And just for that login process, there's 24, 27 requests. Hit stop. Quite a few requests. I can click on, by the way, edit recording before it's uploaded. You can see all the different requests here. And then I'm going to save it to JMeter. When you save using the Chrome extension, it will go and ask you, by the way, which domains you want to be saving, since there's a lot of third-party stuff which we don't want to be recording. And in this case, it was only the 241.254.227 because, again, it's the domain, the IP-based address that I want to save. Hit submit. You'll notice in a few seconds it's converting. It'll save locally to my machine. I'll call this, let's say, test 777 in downloads. Save. And now if I go and load that here on my machine, file, open test 777, you'll see all the different requests here. And in this case, it was a sign in. Actually, let me really quickly add to the thread group. Let me add, again, the view results tree. I'm going to play this back with just one user and one loop. And what you'll see is that it makes it through the first few steps and then it starts to fail. Like the sign-in failed and the actual posting failed because they get unauthorized. So at this point, again, you do need to go in and try to, like I said, look for the responses to understand within the response data what the actual request was. Here goes status 401, that wasn't good. Here, and then it's basically some detective work. So that in a nutshell is how to deal with authentication. Another thing which people ask a lot about is how do I deal with dynamic data in terms of, let's say I have a list of 500 users that I want logging into my website. And I want each of them to have their own username and password, or any other dynamic data which I want to read from a CSV file. That's actually very simple in JMeter. All I need to do, let me bring up here the example that I have beforehand. Just 1 second. All I need to do is if I do a right click again on the thread group, I do add config element, CSV dataset config is the name of the element you're looking for. And in the CSV dataset config, you put the name of the actual CSV file. This will be something like, home/ophir/file.csv. You put the variable names, user/login/ID. The rest of the stuff should be more or less self-explanatory. But the fact that I use user and login ID, those are the variable names to use within my script. So in this case, I actually have title and content, which are the two variable names that I'm using in this script. And here, you can see that I'm using title here and content here in order to actually push the data. So again, $squiggly, the name of the variable, close squiggly, this is how I define title, this is how I define the content variable, and that's really all you need to do. At this point, every time I loop over the script, I'll be reading a different line from the CSV dataset config. You might also notice things, by the way, like $__random string. JMeter does have built in a lot of functionality for functions that if you go to options, function helper dialog, you can actually see, I went to a different window just a second, but you'll actually be able to see within JMeter all your different, I can't see it right now because I have two windows running. But if again, options, the function helper dialog will show you all the different functions within JMeter and give you some help on that. So that in a nutshell is how to deal with the two biggest issues, the authentication tokens and CSV. So going back now to our slides, we still have a few minutes and I want to make sure we covered Jenkins integration. So until now we've talked about I'm using basically on a single user on my laptop. But in today's environment, what we're seeing more and more is that in order to create kind of an agile testing environment where ideally you're actually testing on every single build, then users are using either Jenkins or Bamboo or TeamCity. And in an ideal case situation, you want to actually be running your JMeter test at the end of every build. So there's two ways you can do so. If you want to do things totally on your own, you can go and do here a Google search for JMeter Jenkins, and there's something called the Performance Plugin, and you'll probably see some blogs as well. This is a good blog entry, automating JMeter tests with Maven in Jenkins, which will show you how to use a command line tool or the command line version of JMeter with Maven and actually run the tests. It works. There is a lot of configuration stuff to do. You need to have a machine which can always go and run Jenkins, but it works, and the results are actually pretty cool overall. Option 2, which I want to show you, is if you're using BlazeMeter, which will show you how to, I'll show you in 1 second. If you're using BlazeMeter, we do have a plugin, a Jenkins plugin. Let me show you that really quick. Here you go. So BlazeMeter has a Jenkins plugin. You can find it by simply searching for BlazeMeter Jenkins plugin, which allows you under your Jenkins configuration. Here's my Jenkins configuration. Under configure, let me leave this page. Under configure of my Jenkins configuration, you'll see at the very, very end, I've added something called the BlazeMeter, and this is a post-build action. So in terms of installation, you just download the plugin into your Jenkins. You do need to add your API key in order for it to connect to your BlazeMeter account. And at this point, here's my API key. You can choose an existing BlazeMeter test, and then you can define within Jenkins what you want to consider an unstable or a failed test, depending either on the percentage of errors that are returned or the response time thresholds. So that's overall for the entire test, how many errors you had, or overall for the entire test, what the threshold was. So you can do so by simply defining in here in Jenkins which one. And by the way, for those of you who haven't had a chance to see BlazeMeter before, like here's a list of all of my tests. BlazeMeter is a JMeter as a service, kind of in the cloud company. The analogy I like to give is that GitHub is to Git as BlazeMeter is to JMeter. We basically took the JMeter engine, added a nice web interface, a lot of other cool stuff. But first and foremost, it allows you to run your tests in the cloud in very large numbers. So here, if I had a test, I would simply, in the Jenkins, pick the test to for each build, what's unstable, what's failed, and save it, and that's it. And then at the end of every build, I would actually be running a test. But of course, if you run a test, I want to see what the results look like. So if I look at the results of the build history, I can see there's now something called the BlazeMeter report. And clicking on it will send me a link to the actual report of running that test. So this gives me some great kind of history for every single build. I can see what the response times were, what the errors were, all the great stuff that I get with BlazeMeter's reporting, I can now get as part of every build. And we're not going to go into the specifics of what this shows, but I will say, and if you want, we can definitely give us a call and we'll get more into it. But you can get, for every single build, you can see what was going on for that specific test. And I can go back to a different build, let's say, and I can now, let's say, look at this build in number 7, and I can click on BlazeMeter report and see what happened in this build. And I can even compare build to build. So if I look at these results, I can do select test report for comparison. I can look at the build from, let's say, this one, and wait a few seconds. And here I can actually see 2 lines. There's a kind of a thin line or a thick line. If I zoom in just a bit, I can actually see here a bit more. There's actually 2 lines, and I can compare before and after. So to be honest, Jenkins, it's pretty straightforward. I will say that ideally, you do want to be doing this at the end of every build. And there also are integrations, at least on the BlazeMeter side, with TeamCity and Bamboo as well. So this is all great. I'm running everything, but this brings me to the last, but definitely not least question of, well, I get all this great information from BlazeMeter in terms of, let me show you really quickly an example report that I get. All this great information from BlazeMeter in terms of where the response times were and what the latency was. This is an example report of the actual application I showed beforehand of basically going through a flight checkout, kind of doing a search for a flight and ordering some tickets. Here you can see the response time on a per second granularity. This is a BlazeMeter report. So here you can see how the response time is slowly increasing over time. I can see at around 140 users, the app starts to get slow. 140 users, the response time is in dark blue, and then it really goes up, 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 and things really get bad in terms of response times of 20 seconds and up. So I might say, okay, this is all great, but how do I fix my app? Which is where integration with an application performance tool like New Relic comes into play. So BlazeMeter does have a free plugin into New Relic, and let me actually bring up New Relic here. And the cool thing about the plugin, let me actually click on plugin, is that once you've added your New Relic key into your BlazeMeter account, what you're going to see is under the New Relic plugins, this area now called BlazeMeter. And for every test you have and you're running as part of the plugins, you're going to see whenever you run a test, a new instance here. So this New Relic example I literally ran a couple of hours ago. And here I'm going to see the actual information. Let me do just a second, 3 hours. Here you're going to see the actual information. There you go. From a test that I ran a couple of hours ago. So here I have response time and latency and concurrent users and bandwidth, which is information that I'm getting from BlazeMeter. So if I want to know, well, I ran a performance test, what was the response time, what was happening? And here I can see around 1:30, my response times really went up. At that point, if I click on APM and then I just go into the New Relic side of things, here is WordPress demo. This is again the demo site, the WordPress demo site I showed beforehand. I can see, okay, time sent in PHP. I can see the same spike here in terms of when things went back. I can, of course, zoom in here, by the way. This is a general function you have as part of New Relic. And then I can go down and also look at the specifics of the transactions for each page, how long the actual transaction took, what was the throughput. Yeah, I can look at the database in terms of the database calls. Now, I'm not going to go into all the specifics of how New Relic works, but I will say the integration is really as simple as just adding your API key. That's all you need to do in BlazeMeter, and all the data will be pushed into New Relic. So when you go and add a test, let me show you here. Or actually, you know what? There's two different interfaces depending on which version of BlazeMeter you're working. For those of you who are joining us today, by the way, you might notice that I'm using both this interface, which is the newer interface of BlazeMeter, and you might also sometimes be seeing this interface, just a second, which is the slightly older interface of BlazeMeter. They both work fine. The newer interface, I think, is a little cooler in terms of being able to use things. They both work fine. Simply, some users who are using the older interface haven't had an opportunity to move over to the new interface yet, and we're not forcing anybody to switch over. So at this point, we do have only 5 minutes left. I do want to go over some specifics of some questions. So I'm going to go over some specifics regarding when the recording will be available. It will be available within 24 to 48 hours, and we'll send everybody a link. What's the difference between Lodo Sophia and New Relic? So Lodo Sophia, which is similar to BlazeMeter, are tools which will allow you to run a BlazeMeter test or a JMeter test and get the JMeter data. But at the end of the day, you're getting data from the client. Again, JMeter is simulating the client. New Relic, on the other hand, requires you install an agent on your backend server, and New Relic will show you things like your actual database activity or some server data if you look at servers. This will show you the monitoring of your server itself. So what the memory, what the CPU was, what the app was. So you get all this great data on the actual backend servers. Because at the end of the day, if I tell you that your app is slow, you still need to go and find where the bottleneck is. Regarding the Chrome recorder, there's a question. So yes, regarding the Chrome recorder, the best way to find the Chrome recorder is actually just to do a quick search for BlazeMeter and Chrome in Google. And the first result is the actual Chrome store, and you can download the Chrome recorder here as well. You can see it's used by quite a lot of users. Over 4,000 users are using it. It's already added here, so you obviously can't add it, but that's how you download from the Chrome store the Chrome recorder. So again, I'm open to additional questions. At this point, we are opening up to questions.